Hey guys, wait up! Whoa. Cool. Saved your life! Oh, you guys made me eat! What's that? I know what that is. Oh, Sandy Plankin saw one. He said it was called, a butt. Wow, that's a pretty big butt.
Oh, look at me! I'm gonna go touch the butt! Oh, yeah? Let's see you get closer.
Okay. Beat that! Come on, Nemo, how far can you go? Oh, my dad says it's not safe.
Nemo! No!
Dad?
Oh, you're about to swim into open water.
No, I wasn't.
It's just a good thing I was here.
Dad,
If I hadn't shown up, I don't know.
He wasn't gonna go. Yeah, he was too afraid. No, I wasn't.
This does not concern you, kids. And you're lucky I don't tell your parents you were out there. You know you can't swim well.
I can swim fine, Dad, okay?
No, it's not okay. You shouldn't be anywhere near here. Okay, I was right. You know what? We'll start school in a year or two.
No, Dad! Just because you're scared of the ocean...
Clearly you're not ready, and you're not coming back until you are. You think you can do these things, but you just can't, Nemo.
I hate you.
There's nothing to see. Gather, over there. Excuse me, is there anything I can do? I am a scientist, sir. Is there any problem?
You know, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt things. He isn't a good swimmer, and I just think it's a little too soon for him to be out here unsupervised.
Well, I can assure you he's quite safe with me.
Look, I'm sure he is. But you have a large class, and he can get lost, from sight if you're not looking. No, I'm not saying you're not looking.
Oh, my gosh! Nemo's swimming out the sea!
Nemo! What do you think you're doing? You're gonna get stuck out there, and I'm gonna have to get you before another fish does. Get back here! I said get back here now! Stop! You take one more move, mister. Don't you dare! If you put one fin on that boat, are you listening to me? Don't touch the boat. Nemo!
He touched the butt.
You just pounded your little tail right back here, Nemo. That's right. You were in big trouble, young man. Do you hear me? Big I'm coming, Nemo!
Oh. Welcome to Hope Ankeny, and happy 4th of July, everyone. It's good to be here with you. My name is Ashley Lentz. I'm one of the pastors here. We had to have some Nemo this morning. It's family worship weekend, so what better than some Finding Nemo? We are in a mini sermon series. It's just 2 weeks long, so Pastor Scott preached last weekend on finding rest and renewal for our souls. And this weekend, I get to preach on freedom. We're in the series, Give Me a Break. And so finding rest and renewal and finding freedom are part of finding health as a Christian, finding a break as a Christian, and a break in the busyness of life. And so happy 4th of July, right? So we get to talk about freedom, not so much patriotic freedom this morning, as we're talking about freedom and what it means to be a Christian. And that clip from Nemo depicts the importance of rules. Nemo's dad has rules for Nemo to not leave the reef, to not swim out into open water because it can be dangerous out there. And Nemo decides he just doesn't really want to follow the rules. And as that clip ends, you realize that was maybe not a good decision for Nemo. And we'll pick Nemo up as we go this morning. But I'm wondering, what are the things in your life? What are some of the freedoms that you have that you would maybe prefer to not follow the rules on? What are those things in life where you say, I know I'm supposed to maybe do this, but I think I'm going to prefer to do something that way? It's actually a very scriptural controversy. Paul writes in Romans 7, I don't do the things that I should do, but I know the things I should do, but I don't do those things, and I don't know why. And he kind of goes back and forth with this. And so as we dive in this morning, I want to explore the importance of rules as a Christian, but how do we find freedom in those rules? How do we actually embrace what it means to be free as a Christian in the entirety of what that means? Because it actually does include some rules. It actually does include some things that we should do to be closer to God, to find freedom and experience that freedom. As I wrote the weekly email this week, I've been in so many conversations with a lot of you. I put this in the email. I'll ask, how's your summer going? And most of you are like, it is just flying by. I wonder if you can relate to that. It's just going by so quickly. So as we begin this message on freedom, I want you to think, what are the things that you would say are maybe you are enslaved to? Are you enslaved to a schedule? Are you enslaved to a pace of life or the way that life should be? Because the reality of being a Christian is that we should be free from all of those things that tend to hold us down or tend to hold us back. And so just keep that question in the back of your mind. What do I feel like a slave to right now in my life currently? What is it that maybe holds me back that I don't experience the fullness of life? And we'll see what Jesus has to say about that this morning. First, let's begin with some misconceptions about Christianity. I think maybe you can relate to this list, or maybe you know people who can relate to this list. But as Christians, there has maybe been a season of your life where you think it maybe is not all that fun to be a Christian, or maybe it took you a while to be a Christian. I grew up as a Christian. I didn't really have time to think about these things. I'm not sure I was given an option, but I have friends for sure who have literally said some of these things to me, and I wonder if you can relate to any of them. So some misconceptions about Christianity. Well, it's just boxes to check. If you're a Christian, really you just show up and do the stuff, and that's really the entirety of it. No thanks. It's just rules to follow. Here are all the things that Christians do, and here are all the things that Christians don't do. There's a lot of those don'ts, is the misperception. Don't do this, don't do that, don't do this, don't do that. Only do a few of these things, but as a Christian, you don't do all this other stuff. And ultimately, that leads to Christianity is just no fun. I don't think I'll participate in what it means to be a Christian because it's just really no fun. I'm not sure why anyone would choose to do that. Does this ring any bells? Have you ever thought these things or know anybody who thinks these things? But really, for a lot of people in the world today, I hear they'd rather be spiritual than religious because religious means these things. And really what Jesus has to say about this, what Jesus has done for you, breaks us out of these things. It is not just boxes to check. It's not just rules to follow. It's not don't do this, don't do that. And actually, it should be the most fun thing you do in your life. It should be the most fun and exciting thing that defines who you are. And that's what freedom is as a Christian. Our Bible verse today was from Galatians chapter 5. Here's how it started. For you have been called to live in freedom, my brothers and sisters. But don't use your freedom to satisfy your sinful nature. Instead, use your freedom to serve one another in love. For the whole law can be summed up in this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. I highlighted a couple words here on the screen. The first one's freedom. Paul writes, you have been called to live in freedom. Do you feel like your life is defined by freedom? If you define yourself as a Christian, the answer should be yes. I find freedom each and every day because I know Jesus. And if you can't honestly answer yes to that, you're not alone. And that's what we're talking about this morning. So stay awake. I promise it'll get better. But you are called to live in freedom, brothers and sisters, and use that freedom to serve one another in love. We'll dive into this word a little bit later. For the whole law can be summed up in this one command: love your neighbor as yourself. And I highlighted law in red because it seems opposite of freedom to me. When we read that, it's like, how can we have freedom and experience the law? How do we abide by this law, love your neighbor as yourself, and experience freedom? And it's important to understand what's actually happening in Galatians. Galatians is a great book. Paul is writing this letter to an early church in the town of Galatia. There's a lot of things happening. If you have a chance this weekend, read the letter to the Galatians. It is 6 short chapters. It will not take you long. And if we could read it together, I would do that with you, but I just don't have time. So I'm going to bullet point for you what's actually happening, but go back and read it because it's so good. Ultimately, there is a conflict in this church in Galatia between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians regarding that word law. They're confused on what the law is, and it's important that we distinguish what's a Jewish Christian And what is a Gentile Christian? Because aren't they both Christians? Well, yes, but this is one of the first churches that was established after Jesus died. In fact, Galatians is probably the first New Testament document that we have. It was probably the first New Testament document written. So our New Testaments start with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the Gospels, but those were actually written after Paul's letters. So this was literally one of the first things Paul was encountering as they were spreading the good news about Jesus, as they were establishing churches. It was written on Paul's first missionary journey. And what was happening is there's a hodgepodge of people in these early churches because you had Jewish people who followed the Old Testament law. That's what we hold in our hands today. We hold Old Testament scriptures in our hands, Jewish scriptures, if you will. And there were people who followed that, but were trying to figure out what it meant to be a Christian. And there were what's called Gentile people. These were people from a whole bunch of different nationalities. A lot of them probably worshiped many gods. A lot of them probably worshiped the emperor of Rome. That was a law at the time. But they have no experience with Old Testament law. They didn't have the Old Testament as their scripture. So they're figuring out, I want to be a Christ follower too, but I do not understand what these Jewish folks are talking about when they talk about Old Testament law. So people are trying to be Christians, but there's a little bit of confusion on what that means because of the law, and we'll get into that in a minute. But Paul calls them agitators who are spreading false information. That's literally what he calls them in the letter to the Galatians. There are agitators mixing stuff up, not in a good way, in this early church. The agitators were imposing Jewish law on all of these Gentile Christians. So in essence, they were enslaving Gentiles to a Jewish way of life, although everyone was supposed to be free in Christ. And ultimately, Paul has to confront Peter, another apostle, someone else who's spreading the good news of Jesus and establishing churches, about being a hypocrite. I wonder if that's one of those words we could add to our previous list. I don't want to be a Christian because they're hypocrites. They say one thing, but do another. No thanks. I don't want to sign up for something that's hypocritical. Right away in Galatians chapter 2, Paul has to talk to Peter about this. And this gives you a good glimpse of what's happening in this church. When Peter, first arrived, he ate with the Gentile believers who were not circumcised. But afterward, when some friends of James came, Peter wouldn't eat with the Gentiles anymore. He was afraid of criticism from these people who insisted on the necessity of circumcision. As a result, other Jewish believers followed Peter's hypocrisy, and even Barnabas was led astray by their hypocrisy. Eating together with people was a really big deal. We see Jesus eating with people like tax collectors and sinners, people he really shouldn't have been eating with for those standards of the day. And so when these new churches are being established, Peter and Paul are kind of the leaders of these churches, and who they eat with matters. And originally, Peter is going to eat with Gentile believers. He's cool with that because everybody's welcome in this new kingdom of God. But real quickly, Peter becomes afraid of criticism from people who insisted on the necessity of circumcision. Now, we can't really relate to this Old Testament law. This was an Old Testament law that all boys were to be circumcised, and it set apart God's Jewish people from the rest of the nation, and that's what they're debating in this early church. The Jewish Christians are telling the Gentile Christians, hey, you all have to be circumcised, and they're saying, but we're not Jewish. We follow Jesus, and that law was redefined in him. And it leads to all this hypocrisy. The law is important, but not when it leads us to be hypocrites, but not when it leads us astray or imposes rules that don't really make sense, that don't really matter. And in that Galatians 5 verse, we're told that the law is summed up as love your neighbor as yourself. For you and I, we don't follow the Old Testament law. There's over 600 laws in the Old Testament. As far as I know, we're not Jewish, so we don't adhere to those laws. But we do adhere to what Jesus has redefined as the law. Jesus says, I haven't come to abolish the law, but he came to fulfill the law. And his fulfillment of that law was love God and love others, and we are held to that standard. N.T. Wright sums up this original controversy really well, which will lead us into how we experience freedom today. N.T. Wright says, circumcision was one of the fiercest controversies in the early church. It was precisely in that context, the entry of Gentiles into God's people, and the question of whether they had to be circumcised or whether they could be full members as they were, that Paul developed his doctrine of justification by faith. I wonder if you've ever heard that phrase before. Justification by faith. We believe as Christians that we are saved by grace through faith alone. And it's within this letter to the Gentiles, believe it or not, that we start to see why this became a doctrine of our faith. Because people were debating things that kind of enslaved them, that held them to specific standards that weren't really of God. But we are saved by faith alone. And right off the bat, Paul writes in Galatians chapter 2, he says, I do not set aside the grace of God. For if righteousness could be gained through the law, Christ died for nothing. I do not set aside the grace of God, for if righteousness could be gained through the law, Christ died for nothing. That applies to you and me today too. If we could be made right with God through anything we do, then Jesus died for nothing. In Galatians 5, so Christ has truly set us free. Now make sure that you stay free and don't get tied up again in slavery to the law. Are you starting to see this free and law dynamic? We have freedom. The law has been redefined. We have freedom. Don't be enslaved to it. By nature, we are slaves to sin. We are bound by sin because we are not perfect. And so to understand what it means to be free in Christ, we have to understand this dynamic of law and freedom. It's a really Lutheran thing, okay? I took a whole class on this in seminary school, and leave it to Ashley to link together Finding Nemo and something deeply Lutheran. So we're going to scratch the surface. This is called law and gospel. Like I said, I took a whole class called law and gospel, and I'm just going to graze this for you. But we need both. We need rules to live a safe, happy, satisfying life. We need to love God and love others. Not because it's a checkbox, not because it's this list of don't do these things, but because it's freedom. And by golly, we need Jesus because we don't do the law very well either, all the time. So we need both, and this is called law and gospel. So what is law? Law can mean a whole bunch of things in theological circles. We kind of touched on it, but the law in the Old Testament is the first 5 books of the Old Testament. There's over 600 laws written down in those books, and we're not bound to that law. It is the old covenant. Testament means covenant. Covenant means promise. It is the old promise. We are Christians, so we follow the new promise, the New Testament. That law is redefined as love God and love others. But the function of the Old Testament law, it placed an emphasis on believers to follow God's requirements for their life. Notice the emphasis is on believers to follow. It is all up to the people of God to follow those rules of God. That's a heavy burden to bear. And as we've been reading through the Old Testament, we're reading through the Bible in a year here at Hope Ankeny. If you've been following along, we're almost done with the Old Testament, which is like a woohoo, because it's kind of long. It gets kind of boring, gets kind of confusing. But there's this cycle throughout the whole Old Testament. God rescues his people, he redeems them, and he gives them laws for a rich and satisfying life, and they don't add up. So they have to be redeemed and rescued again. So he sends prophets and judges, and guess what? They still can't follow, and it's this whole cycle throughout the Old Testament, and that leads us here. The Old Testament law functions throughout history to lead us directly to Jesus Christ. The Old Testament folks couldn't keep up with the law. They could never do it perfectly, and therefore needed a Savior. While we're not bound to the Old Testament law, how are you doing loving God perfectly? How are you doing loving others perfectly? How are you doing loving yourself perfectly? We're not perfect at those things all the time, and therefore we are led directly to Jesus, which is why we also need gospel. Gospel, put really simply, is the good news of Jesus Christ. It's what Jesus has already done for us. He came, he died, and he resurrected for you. Notice that places the emphasis on Christ. The law places the emphasis on believers to do all this stuff. The gospel places the emphasis on Christ, and we have to have them both. I can't add up to what God is calling me to all the time, and Jesus has already done all the stuff for me. So where do we find freedom in this really weird paradox? How can we have both without overemphasizing one another? If we sum this up, we could say that the law is God's standard for human behavior according to his will. Love God and love others is his standard for our behavior according to how he wants us to live. And because we inevitably fall short, we also need the gospel. I kind of want you to think about it in this way. If law and gospel is kind of like a road, and one side is one ditch and one side is the other ditch. So for example, if we emphasize law over gospel, that's one ditch. And on the other side, if we emphasize gospel over law, that's the other ditch. There are problems with both of that because honestly, if somebody said, Ashley, pick one, law or gospel, I'd be like, gospel, please. I'd rather not check the boxes. I'd rather not follow all the stuff. I'd rather place the emphasis on Jesus, not on myself. But there's a problem with that too, and we'll get there. If we emphasize law over gospel, it puts the focus back on us to do the things and for us to do work to earn salvation. That's not how we get into heaven. We don't do anything. That's not how you are made right with God. We don't do anything. Jesus has already done that for you. So we can't emphasize law over gospel because then we get it wrong. We miss the point. And this is also where you find legalism. If you've ever been part of a church maybe or a community of people who tell you, here are the things you have to do to achieve this next step in your faith. Here are the things you have to do to be welcome at communion. Here are the things you have to do to be forgiven. That's legalism. And it's an emphasis on law over gospel. On the flip side, what if we emphasize gospel over law? That's also not a good place to be. All of these things lead to slavery. Here you're enslaved to the things you can do, to the list of things you might need to do, to the work you think you should do, to the rules. On the other side, we're enslaved to what the world tells us to do. If we emphasize gospel over law, we miss a deeper calling. If it's only up to Jesus, if it only matters what he did, then I don't have any buy-in. I don't actually need to do anything as a believer. That's slavery to the world around me. Rather than have a deeper purpose for my life, I'm going to live however I want because Jesus has already done the stuff. And then our lives seemingly don't need to change. Who cares where my heart is? Who cares if I serve, if I love? Because Jesus has already done everything. Also a form of slavery. And we're not called to slavery in either sense. We're called to freedom. And that's walking the road between. We might call that road grace. Grace is where we find freedom because inevitably we're going to have days where we think we need to check the boxes. Inevitably we're going to have days where we want to take a step back and just relax and not have any buy-in. And in the meantime, we really need grace to walk the road between, to really find freedom. Nemo ends up in a not so great situation because he decided he was just going to do whatever he wanted, perhaps an emphasis on gospel over law. Take a quick look and see what happened to Nemo.
You miss your dad, don't you, Shuckbait?
Yeah,
Well, you're lucky to have someone out there who's looking for you.
he's not looking for me. He's scared of the ocean.
Peach, any movement?
He's had at least 4 cups of coffee. It's got to be soon.
Keep on him. My first escape landed on dental tools. I was aiming for the toilet.
Toilet?
All drains lead to the ocean, kid.
Wow. How many times have you tried to get out?
I've lost count. Fish aren't meant to be in a box, kid. It does things to you.
Fish aren't meant to be in a box, kid. It does stuff to you. Christians aren't meant to be in a box either. We're not meant to be on either side of the ditch or to be confused or bound or enslaved. It's time to break out of those boxes. That's what freedom is in Jesus. So how do we fully embrace this freedom? Now that we kind of understand law and gospel, how do we embrace walking the road between? What does freedom look like in our lives? Because as Christians, we should be the most free people in the world. Thank goodness we live in this country where we get to worship freely. That's something to celebrate today. But also, whether we lived here or anywhere else, Christians should be the most free people in the world because we know Jesus. I told you this was a deep Lutheran theology thing. Martin Luther wrote a whole treatise, if you will, called The Freedom of a Christian. And he based that treatise on his lectures about Galatians. Galatians was his most favorite book in the New Testament. He compares his love of Galatians to how much he loved his wife. Okay, to put it in perspective, that's how much he loved the book of Galatians. Here's what he writes in The Freedom of a Christian. He says, a Christian has no need of any law in order to be saved, since through faith we are free from every law. Thus, all the acts of a Christian are done spontaneously, out of a sense of pure liberty. As Christians, we do not seek our own advantage or salvation because we're already fully satisfied and saved by God's grace through faith. Now, our only motive is to do that which is pleasing to God. Are you starting to see this law and gospel, this freedom and law dynamic here? Because we're saved through faith. We're free from every law. We don't actually have to do anything, but all the acts of a Christian, the work, the things that we do are done spontaneously. Why? Because we're free out of a pure sense of liberty. We're already fully satisfied and saved by God's grace through faith. So now our only motive is not to earn salvation, is not to get better in with God, is not to make him more happy with us or to undo our past mistakes. Our only motive is to do that which is pleasing to God. Why? Because we're free. How are you doing on this? Do your lives feel free? Do you do stuff that is pleasing to God because you're free, or do you do it because you feel like you have to? This freedom is the most powerful thing you will ever experience in the world, and are you embracing it? So often I look around and I think, golly, Christian brothers and sisters, we're missing it. We're missing it. Use your freedom. It should bubble up out of you. People should recognize that freedom and say, I want that. When you say I'm a Christian and they give you all those misconceptions, you can say, no, it's freeing. I am not bound to a box or a set of rules or a list of don'ts. I am free because Jesus has done everything for me. And let me show you what that freedom looks like. That freedom looks like service. Use your freedom to serve. It kind of seems odd, right? Like that freedom and serving would go hand in hand because serving is kind of the opposite of being free, it sounds like in my mind. But serving is the most selfless thing we can do. To give it away to other people. We read Galatians 5, the beginning of that verse. If you go to the next slide, please. Someone fell asleep up in production. There we go, thanks. Let's read this Galatians 5:13 together. For you have been called to live in freedom, my brothers and sisters. But don't use your freedom to satisfy your sinful nature. Instead, use your freedom to serve one another in love. Use your freedom to serve one another in love. It's the most selfless and freeing thing you will ever do. I don't mean just serving within the church. We have a million ways you can serve within the church if you're curious about that. But I bet each of you serves people every single day in your regular life. And does that feel like freedom to you, or does it feel like slavery? We have to feed our kids, right? They have to eat. That's something we have to do. But where is the mindset when we do those things? Do we feed our kids because we have to and they have to eat, which is true? Or do we feed them with a mindset that is, what a privilege and honor to be a parent today? Sure, it's hard. Friends, this is not easy, right? The parents are rolling their eyes at me going, you think it's that easy to be a parent? No, it's not easy. But what if the mindset every day was, what a privilege and honor to do this thing, and I'm going to do it because I love these people, not because I have to. It's so easy to take these things for granted. But serving out of love will change your life. That's true freedom. The most selfless thing you'll do is to serve someone out of love. And I wonder how our lives would change if rather than serving because we had to in our jobs, at home, with friends, with family, with neighbors, if the mindset was, what an honor and a privilege, and I get to do this because I love these people. Use your freedom, friends, to grow closer to God. This is also not an easy one. You show me a hypocritical, very opinionated, legalistic Christian or somebody who's actually decided they want no buy-in, and I'll show you a Christian who got comfortable. I'll show you someone who got complacent. It's uncomfortable. I'm going to challenge you a little bit. Step out of the box. Following Jesus is a growing experience. That's a core value here at Hope. If you are comfortable in your faith journey, you're missing it. If you're comfortable showing up to worship weekly, then you're missing it. If you're comfortable with the things you do daily because you're a Christian and you're maybe just checking the boxes, you're missing it. Following Jesus is a growing experience, so get uncomfortable, friends. It's hard. I've been comfortable in my faith journey too. What do you need to do to step out of those boxes, to get a little bit uncomfortable, to challenge yourself a little bit? Because when we stop growing, we stop being in relationship with God. We stop getting closer. Did you know you can be enslaved as a Christian doing Christian things? If you come to worship weekly to check the box, that's not freedom. I probably don't have to tell you that. You probably feel that. You probably don't feel entirely free as a Christian because you're coming because you have to, or you think you have to. Get uncomfortable. I'm going to make you a little bit uncomfortable this morning. On Tuesday evenings, we have a young adult small group. We've only met, it was a 6-week class, and every week we just talked about something different. And this week, they were my guinea pigs for this sermon. And so we talked about freedom, and I asked them, how would you define freedom as a Christian? What does it feel like? How do you experience freedom as a Christian? And we had an excellent conversation. And toward the end of the evening, one of the women in the group said, I cognitively understand freedom as a Christian. She's like, and I think I feel it. But she said, you know what doesn't feel free to me as a Christian? She's like, I really have a hard time forming opinions about things in the world around me. And her example was like politics. She said, as a Christian, there's so many people and things and social media outlets who tell me what a Christian should believe on these issues. Not just politics, name any hot button topic issue of our society. And she said, it is burdensome to me to be a Christian, for my friends to know that I'm a Christian, and to have to form opinions on those things. Because if I say one thing, a whole bunch of Christians are mad at me. If I say something else, a whole bunch of other Christians are mad at me. And she said, that doesn't feel like freedom. And I said, you're right, that's slavery. And it's slavery to what the world has to say about those things. I wonder how many of us can relate to that feeling. Because when she said that, I was like, yeah, I feel that too, which is why I just don't get on social media. It's why I just don't tell people my political opinions. Because everybody thinks they get a say in those things. And brothers and sisters, let me tell you, there are Christians across the whole spectrum of every political belief, of every hot button topic issue you can find. And the reality is, that's a good thing. We're not all supposed to believe the same thing about every single thing in the world. We're all unique people. And by the way, you have an audience of one. You answer to one. It's God. And if you feel enslaved because you're a Christian and you don't know what to believe about those things, whose voice are you listening to? Are you listening to God's voice? Or are you listening to the voices of the world? Because one of those is freedom and one of those is slavery. And it's really easy to get caught up in slavery. Certainly we should form opinions. Certainly we should have conversations with each other about them. But you answer to God. And when was the last time you were in a conversation with someone who maybe disagreed with you politically, and your response to them was, that's between you and God, and that's between me and God? How freeing is that? Because that's the reality, friends. If you don't feel free as a Christian, ask yourself why. Because Jesus didn't come for you to feel enslaved to the world, for you to feel enslaved to the opinions of the world, for you to feel enslaved to a list of things you feel like you have to do. That's not why he came. That's not why he died for you. He died so that you could have the most freedom in the world as a Christian, as a Christ follower. And that is summed up as love God and love others. And it bubbles out of us as we serve, as we grow. No, it's not comfortable. It's really hard. But all good things in life are hard. If it was easy, everyone would do it. And you're called to so much more than feeling bound to the world, than hanging out in a box. It's time to jump out of those boxes, break down the boxes, and throw them away, because you answer to God, and he has freedom in store for you. One last clip from Finding Nemo about the joys of freedom. Take a look.
Dory, where's Nemo?
There!
Oh, no. Nemo! Nemo? Nemo? It's okay. Daddy's here. Daddy's got you.
Daddy?
Oh, thank goodness.
Dad, I don't hate you.
Oh, no. I'm so sorry, Nemo. Hey, guess what?
What?
Sea turtles? I met one. And he was 150 years old.
150?
Yep.
Because Sandy Plankton said they only live to be 100.
Sandy Plankton? Do you think I would cross the entire ocean and not know as much as Sandy Plankton? He was 150, not 100. Who's the Sandy Plankton